Half a century after Baha'u'llah summoned the kings and rulers to be reconciled among themselves and enjoined on them the establishment of peace on earth, the great powers of that era were plunged into war. It was the first conflict to be regarded as a world war, and it is remembered as a conflagration of horrific severity. The unprecedented scale and ferocity of the bloodshed has seared it onto the consciousness of every succeeding generation. And yet, from out the ruin and suffering, possibilities blossomed for a new order to bring stability to the world, notably at the Paris Peace Conference, which opened 100 years ago. In the years that followed, despite the repeated crises into which international affairs were thrown, Shoghi Effendi could discern the progress, however fitful, of the forces working in harmony with the spirit of the age. These forces have continued to move humanity towards an age of peace, not merely a peace which rules out armed conflict, but a collective state of being, manifesting unity. Notwithstanding, it remains a long journey, and it proceeds in fits and starts. We find it propitious at this moment to reflect on the progress made on that journey, the contemporary challenges to peace, and the contribution to its attainment that Baha'is are called to make. There have been at least 3 historical moments in the last 100 years when it seemed as if the human race was reaching for real, lasting peace, albeit always falling short because of weaknesses it could not overcome.
World War I was one of the most disastrous and surprising events, I think, of the 20th century. It is still remembered as, it's called the war that will end all wars, because it was so horrible, because it was totally unexpected by the leaders of the world at that time, who were parts of these very important Western empires, and also eventually by people. They were just absolutely shocked at the level of human suffering and human loss and loss of everything. And so it was so horrific that, in a sense, it shocked the world, and especially the leaders, into thinking of measures that they might be able to take so that such a war does not repeat again.
The first moment, as a result of the Paris Conference, was the establishment of the League of Nations, an organization intended by its founders to secure peace at the international level. It was the means by which, for the first time in history, the system of collective security enjoined on the world's rulers by Baha'u'llah was seriously envisaged, discussed, and tested. But ultimately, the peace agreement that concluded the war was fatally flawed, and the League was not able to prevent a second world war, judged by historians to be the deadliest conflict in human history.
In the Baha'i writings, we're told that peace is inevitable. This is a really interesting statement. It is inevitable, and yet we're told that one of the very important things we need to recognize is that we have the gift of free will. We have a choice to make at every turn, a choice about how quickly that peace will come. So while peace is inevitable, how quickly it will come or how slowly depends on the choices we take and the actions we take. Let me give you a couple of examples. In the last 100 years, since the end of the First World War and the Paris Peace Conference, humanity has had 3 golden opportunities to reach for a lasting peace. Unfortunately, in each case, although we reached for it, certain weaknesses inherent in us and in our systems have caused us to fail to achieve a lasting peace. The first one was our attempt to set up a League of Nations after the First World War, which unfortunately ended up in disaster. Because the League was not representative of all the nations of the world, because it only met 4 times a year, because it insisted on absolute unanimity in decisions.
Some of the great powers just decided that it was not in their interest to be a part of it, like the United States, surprisingly, despite the fact that the League was Woodrow Wilson's idea. It failed to actually ratify the Versailles Treaty. And then gradually, over the course of the 20s and 30s, powers such as Germany left the League and had their own national interest to pursue. But underlying all of this was a failure to actually gain widespread adherence to the concept that what was in one's national interest also was in the global interest. In other words, if one was pursuing something that was detrimental to the world as a whole, but that one thought was in one's national interest, it in fact was not in one's national interest. And the global population had not been educated to this idea. And there were other counter ideas that arose, especially after the crises of the 1920s. There were monetary crises in places like Germany. There was the Great Depression that began in the late 1920s. All of these things put tremendous pressure on societies to adopt some of the views of some of the autocratic rulers that emerged throughout Europe at that time.
Just as the first significant step towards world peace followed a period of appalling conflict, so did the second, when not only was the United Nations organization formed from the ashes of the League, but a system of international economic institutions came into being, and historic advances were made relating to human rights and international law. In rapid succession, many territories under colonial rule became independent nations, and arrangements for regional cooperation grew markedly in depth and range.
World War II was really the rupture of the 20th century, in my opinion. I mean, it's when for the first time, I think, human beings saw how evil we can be. It isn't that there wasn't evil before, but the killing of millions of totally innocent people who had never committed any crimes or did anything wrong. They were just people living out their lives. To destroy 6 million, some Jews, and smaller numbers of other populations based on eugenics and all of that. This rupture in the 20th century, this war, was so horrific that once again, the leaders of the world said, we need to rethink all of this again. We need to come up with some other configuration, some other measure to prevent this from ever happening again, having witnessed World War I, of course.
After the Second World War, we created the United Nations. Again, a significant step that we took in the direction of peace, hoping that it would be a lasting step. Unfortunately, again, it didn't succeed in its original aim. And despite the many wonderful strides that the United Nations made and other strides we created in terms of the development of human rights law and international law and international economic institutions, the UN again failed, and we ended up in the Cold War between these two powerful blocs in the world. We all know how that went. It ended up putting us in fear of a nuclear holocaust. And it was with great relief at the end of the 20th century that we passed through the Cold War and we thought, okay, this is yet another chance for peace.
The post-war decades, however, were also characterized by an atmosphere of brooding and often open hostility between the world's two major power blocs. Known familiarly as the Cold War, it spilled over into actual wars in various regions of the world and brought humanity perilously close to a conflict involving nuclear weapons. Its peaceful termination towards the end of the 20th century was an occasion for relief, giving rise to explicit calls for the establishment of a new global order. This was the third moment when universal peace seemed to be within grasp.
Of course, the biggest opportunity that has came after the end of the Cold War, when there was no longer the enormous ideological rift between the East and the West. And there appeared, in fact, with the establishment of the global goals that were set in the 1990s, especially the Millennium Goals, that there was finally some global consensus as to where the world would go. However, for a variety of reasons, many of them related to the disadvantages and alienation that has resulted from some aspects of globalization, especially some of the economic aspects of globalization. There's been some backward movement over the last roughly 15 years. And that backward movement has resulted in a resurgence of nationalism, a resurgence of greater ethnic identification, and even a resurgence in racism in some parts of the world.
Efforts to put in place new systems for international cooperation and to strengthen existing ones received great impetus as a series of world conferences on themes of importance to humanity's future were convened by the United Nations. New opportunities for consensus emerged, and the spirit of collaboration propelling progress also found expression in the mandates given to certain international institutions charged with administering justice. This purposeful, deliberative process culminated at the turn of the century in the Millennium Forum, a meeting of representatives of over 1,000 civil society organizations from more than 100 countries, followed by the Millennium Summit, an unparalleled gathering of world leaders which led to agreement on a set of objectives representing a shared ambition of humanity. Styled the Millennium Development Goals, they became rallying points for collective action in the ensuing years. These various advances, despite their many limitations and imperfections, and the horrifying conflicts that continued to unfold during this time, stand nonetheless as signs of a widespread, gradual, but inexorable rise in global consciousness on the part of the Earth's peoples and their attraction to universal justice, to solidarity, to collaboration, to compassion, and to equality. As the present century opened, new challenges began to loom. With time, these intensified, leading to a retreat from the promising steps forward with which the previous century had closed. Today, many of the dominant currents in societies everywhere are pushing people apart, not drawing them together.
This is where the world right now finds itself in great turmoil, because the leaders of the world, no one else in the world can do what the leaders can do. They have the power, they have the means, they have the weapons to destroy. They're the ones in power. And because there is no collaboration, because there is no point of unity among them to solve the problems of the world, including those of their people, we are in a not only an existential crisis, I would really call it more importantly a spiritual crisis, which is terribly, terribly important if we are to move beyond this current system without another major crisis. You see, I think this is what's disturbing, is that do we have to always have a major war like the first and the second in order to wake us up? And how many times do we repeat this attitude and behavior? How many wars will it take? How much suffering? How many human lives should we destroy before leaders give up their power, before leaders stop the corruption? And when will leaders wake up and come together and say, there are so many areas that we are responsible for and have the capacity, have the potential to fix these problems? I think that is the real challenge right now in the world.
Even as global poverty of the most extreme form has decreased, political and economic systems have enabled the enrichment of small coteries with grossly exorbitant wealth, a condition that fuels fundamental instability in world affairs.
When we're talking about self-interest, we're talking not only the self-interest of an individual to the extent of his or her needs, but rather the self-interest of an individual in comparison to the interest of others. In other words, when these two assumptions, the assumption of self-interest and competition, are coupled together, what it implies is that my benefits, my welfare, and my interest takes precedent over yours. And this precedence is unfortunately what is at the core of the problem. In other words, the whole economic arena, the world, is very much like a scene of a race where we are all competing to get to the finish line. And of course, only one person gets to the finish line. And once that finish line is achieved, once those benefits are gained, essentially others are going to be deprived from that. And this could create a lot of problems. And the most important problem is that essentially this level of individualism, in other words, what is at the core of economic theory, that it is the interest of the individual that is the most important at the expense of others. And this is what causes all kinds of issues, most importantly because it violates the first moral principle being that in a society, for it to survive and thrive, it is important that individuals not only think of their own interest, but the interest of the whole. And if we ignore that moral imperative, the consequences are absolutely devastating. In other words, when we think of, let's say, wars do not just start overnight. It starts when the parties engage in this war first think of their own interest and the precedence of their interest over the interest of another country, another self. And then the issue is that in order for me to preserve my national interest, my political interest, I'm willing to get into war with you. And as a result of this war, only one country is going to be the winner.
The interaction of the individual citizen, governing institutions, and society as a whole are often fraught, as those arguing for the primacy of one or the other show more and more intransigence in their thinking. Religious fundamentalism is warping the character of communities, even nations. The failings of so many organizations and institutions of society have understandably led to a decline in public trust. But this has been systematically exploited by vested interests seeking to undermine the credibility of all sources of knowledge. Certain shared ethical principles, which seemed to be in the ascendant at the start of this century, are eroded, threatening the prevailing consensus about right and wrong that, in various arenas, had succeeded in holding humanity's basest tendencies in check. And the will to engage in international collective action, which 20 years ago represented a powerful strain of thinking among world leaders, has been cowed, assailed by resurgent forces of racism, nationalism, and factionalism. Thus do the forces of disintegration regroup and gain ground. So be it. The unification of humanity is unstoppable by any human force. The promises made by the prophets of old and by the author of the cause of God himself testify to this truth. Yet the course humanity takes to achieve its destiny may very well be tortuous. The tumult raised by the contending peoples of the earth threatens to drown out the voices of those noble-minded souls in every society who call for an end to conflict and struggle. As long as that call goes unheeded, there is no reason to doubt that the world's current state of disorder and confusion will worsen, possibly with catastrophic consequences, until a chastened humanity sees fit to take another significant step, perhaps this time decisive, towards enduring peace.
Until people learn to come together and discuss, consult about the principles that we should uphold, the moral framework, if you will, that we should uphold, the spiritual laws that we should consider, unless they unify around that, it's impossible to solve the humongous problems that this world is facing. That's why unity is so important within this context.
Universal peace is the destination towards which humanity has been moving throughout the ages under the influence of the Word of God that has been progressively imparted by the Creator to His creation. Shoghi Effendi described humanity's advance towards a new global stage in its collective life in terms of social evolution, an evolution that has had its earliest beginnings in the birth of family life, its subsequent development in the achievement of tribal solidarity, leading in turn to the constitution of the city-state and expanding later into the institution of independent and sovereign nations. Now, with the coming of Baha'u'llah, the human race stands on the threshold of its maturity. World unity is finally possible. A global order that unifies the nations with the assent of humanity is the only adequate answer to the destabilizing forces that threaten the world.
Every religion has talked about peace from the very beginning. Peace on earth, that the function of religion has basically been peace. But up until now, universal peace has not been possible, because there was a time when we didn't even know there was a new world to discover out there. So how could we talk about universal anything without really recognizing the planet as a whole? So even though previous religions have said peace is important, the Baha'i faith says that we have arrived at a time when universal peace is possible. In other words, I think the whole premise, the whole goal of the Baha'i religion is to establish universal peace. Not because it's a better religion than the others, this is blasphemy, not because it has anything over the other religions, but simply because religion progresses, religion changes, religion is all about change, and therefore we have now again arrived at a time where the teachings of Baha'u'llah address all the things that need to come about, need to be constructed in order to have a world that will have universal peace.
However, though world unity is possible, nay inevitable, it ultimately cannot be achieved without unreserved acceptance of the oneness of humankind, described by the Guardian as the pivot round which all the teachings of Baha'u'llah revolve. With what insight and eloquence did he expound upon the far-reaching implications of this cardinal principle? Plainly he saw, amidst the turbulence of world affairs, how the reality that humanity is one people must be the starting point for a new order. The vast array of relations among nations and within them all need to be re-envisaged in this light. The realization of such a vision will require, sooner or later, an historic feat of statesmanship from the leaders of the world. Alas, the will to attempt this feat is still wanting. Humanity is gripped by a crisis of identity, as various peoples and groups struggle to define themselves, their place in the world, and how they should act. Without a vision of shared identity and common purpose, they fall into competing ideologies and power struggles. Seemingly countless permutations of us and them define group identities ever more narrowly and in contrast to one another.
If we recognize that we are interdependent on each other, in other words, we're not these isolated cells, each one of which is in a pigeonhole in and of itself and is trying to preserve its interest, but that my interest is very significantly integrated with the interest of the whole, the entire program of social objective is going to be very different. In other words, I will then look at not only my interest, but to the extent that my interest or what I would do actually promotes the interest of the whole. Now, this, interestingly enough, this concept is also at the very core of economic analysis. In other words, what we do observe in economics is what we refer to as division of labor. If we want to build a society, every individual will actually collaborate and will produce what is needed for the entire society, and it is this division of labor and the specializing in what I'm good at to do for the benefit of the rest that will ultimately guarantee the welfare and the progress of society.
Imagine creating a system of international relations where the premise of that system is that we are all one and nations are one. Let me give you an example of one of the things that would happen. The Security Council of the United Nations right now consists of a number of members, of whom 5 are permanent members. Only these 5 have the power of veto. This means that in this global village of ours today, where we're 193 nations, if 192 nations believe that a certain course of action is good for the peace of the world, all it takes is for one of these members, permanent members of the Security Council, to say, you know what, I have a great deal of respect for you all, and I honor you, but it's not in our national interest to do this, and I veto this. In today's world, in which we are so interconnected and interdependent, where we have become like the parts of one human body, it simply does not make sense for the liver to say to the kidneys, I don't care if you're diseased, I just care for number 1, for me. This doesn't work because if we want to have a healthy liver or healthy kidneys, the only way to guarantee it is by guaranteeing the health of the entire body.
Over time, this splintering into divergent interest groups has weakened the cohesion of society itself. Rival conceptions about the primacy of a particular people are peddled to the exclusion of the truth that humanity is on a common journey in which all are protagonists. Consider how radically different such a fragmented conception of human identity is from the one that follows from a recognition of the oneness of humanity. In this perspective, the diversity that characterizes the human family, far from contradicting its oneness, endows it with richness. Unity, in its Baha'i expression, contains the essential concept of diversity, distinguishing it from uniformity. It is through love for all people, and by subordinating lesser loyalties to the best interests of humankind, that the unity of the world can be realized, and the infinite expressions of human diversity find their highest fulfillment.
That is so prominent in the Baha'i writings, and that the House of Justice echoes in its statements on universal peace, is the concept of the oneness of humankind. And that concept does not mean sameness, but it does mean that we are unified. And being unified doesn't mean that we all look, act, and behave in the same way. It does mean that we adhere to certain principles, basic principles, like that we should treat each other as we ourselves would like to be treated, and that we accept everyone without discrimination with respect to the benefits of society and also the laws that apply to society. And that we are really interested in making sure that all of the beauty of diversity is actually appreciated. And it's here where I think we go beyond the secular thinking that exists in our world. There are many movements in the world about coexistence, which is a good thing in and of itself, or about people getting along, but actually what the Baha'i writings provide for and what the House of Justice calls for is this love of diversity. There are analogies in the Baha'i writings, many of them about this, and probably one of the most powerful is the concept of a flower garden, and that a flower garden with flowers of diverse colors is far more interesting and far more beautiful than a flower garden that is of one color.
Fostering unity by harmonizing disparate elements and nurturing in every heart a selfless love for humankind is the task of religion. Great possibilities to cultivate fellowship and concord are open to religious leaders, but these same leaders can also incite violence by using their influence to stoke the fires of fanaticism and prejudice. Writing of religion, Baha'u'llah's words are emphatic. Make it not, he warns, the cause of dissension and strife. Peace, for all who dwell on earth, is one of the principles and ordinances of God. A heart that has embraced love for the whole of humanity will certainly be pained when confronted by the suffering that so many endure because of disunity.
It is unfortunate that the concept of religion has been somewhat turned over in its meaning and its concept. Because every time we think about religion or talk about religion, it reminds us of wars and like the Crusades and division among people and domination of one group, especially of the clergy over others. So unfortunately, in today's contemporary concept of religion, we think of religion as something that is divisive. However, the real essential notion of religion is something completely different. In fact, it's the opposite. Starting from the word religion, from the roots of Latin religio, it means to reunite, to bring together. So really the force of religion historically has been to bring people together in a spirit of cooperation and collaboration to achieve certain moral objective, to achieve for the welfare of the society that they were growing and propagating in. Now, with this concept of religion, if we really go back to the roots of reuniting individual, it is very consistent with the moral imperatives that have been discussed by philosophers, by individuals of good intent, philanthropists and all that. They were trying to bring people together. In one sense, in fact, in the Baha'i faith, it's stated that if religion is the cause of division, it is better not to have any religion.
But the friends of God cannot shut themselves off from the increasing turmoil of the society that surrounds them. They must guard themselves, too, from becoming enmeshed in its conflicts or falling into its adversarial methods. No matter how bleak conditions may appear at any given time, no matter how dismal the immediate prospects for bringing about unity, there is no cause for despair. The distressing state of the world can only spur us to redouble our commitment to constructive action. These are not days of prosperity and triumph, cautions Baha'u'llah. The whole of mankind is in the grip of manifold ills. Strive, therefore, to save its life through the wholesome medicine which the almighty hand of the unerring physician hath prepared.
The way I read the Baha'i writings, failure is to be viewed merely as an opportunity for growth rather than a dead end. And the writings themselves give us some hints about how we can change our perspective. So instead of looking at the world and saying, oh my gosh, look at all the wars and crises and tribulations, humanity is just rotten, we've always been aggressive human beings, this is our nature, we're not going to change. The Baha'i writings say, wait a minute, actually, human beings are created noble. And what we're witnessing today is simply the results of humanity going through a turbulent adolescence. Because humanity, if we were to liken it to an individual, has been going through various stages of growth, starting from infanthood to childhood to junior youthhood, adolescence, and then eventually maturity. And we know what adolescents are like. They act out, they push the boundaries, the envelope. That's what we're doing as a global community. By understanding our history in this light, what we do is we understand that there is hope, that we haven't failed, and that we are standing at the threshold of maturity, and it gives us the energy and the power of will that we need to get over the current global challenges.
The establishment of peace is a duty to which the entire human race is called. The responsibility that Baha'is bear to aid that process will evolve over time, but they have never been mere spectators. They lend their share of assistance to the operation of those forces leading humanity towards unity. They are summoned to be as leaven to the world. Consider Baha'u'llah's words. Address yourselves to the promotion of the well-being and tranquility of the children of men. Bend your minds and wills to the education of the peoples and kindreds of the earth, that haply the dissensions that divide it may, through the power of the Most Great Name, be blotted out from its face, and all mankind become the upholders of one order and the inhabitants of one city. Abdu'l-Baha also emphasized the importance of the contribution that Baha'is are called on to make to the establishment of world peace. Peace must first be established among individuals, until it leadeth in the end to peace among nations. Wherefore, O ye Baha'is, strive ye with all your might to create through the power of the Word of God genuine love, spiritual communion, and durable bonds among individuals. This is your task. The promise of world peace, the message we addressed to the people of the world in 1985, set out the Baha'i perspective on the condition of the world and the prerequisites of universal peace. It also offered the global Baha'i community as a model for study that could reinforce hope in the possibility of uniting the human race. In the years since, the followers of Baha'u'llah have been patiently refining that model and working with others around them to build up and broaden a system of social organization based on his teachings. They are learning how to nurture communities that embody those prerequisites of peace we identified in 1985. They cultivate environments in which children can be raised untainted by any form of racial, national, or religious prejudice. They champion the full equality of women with men in the affairs of the community. Their programs of education, transformative in their effects and encompassing both the material and spiritual aspects of life, welcome everyone who wishes to contribute to the community's prosperity. In the stirrings of social action can be seen their desire to remedy the numerous ills afflicting humanity and to empower each person to become a protagonist in the building of a new world.
Now, one aspect of the force of integration are the institutions that the Baha'is are building. But it's not just the Baha'is. It's everyone in the world who is willing to be on the side of integration, to unify around ideas that can actually address the social problems that we're facing in a realistic manner. It is that in that way that everyone in this world, and Baha'u'llah says this actually in his writings, everyone in the world is responsible for peace. It's not just the Baha'is. All of humanity is responsible, because when God speaks from the Baha'i perspective, it's to the whole world. It's to everyone. This belongs to everyone. So this concept of social change in the Baha'i writings, the process of disintegration and integration is extremely important to understand, because I think at some level it makes it easier to survive in the world as an individual, because sometimes this world is so hard to accept because of all the injustices and the oppressions and the violence. It really plays with you, it's so hard to accept.
One of the most challenging things for many people to realize is that the processes that are underway in the Baha'i community today, in which capacity is being built to engage in the discourses of society, to affect how people think about issues, to engage in social action, even if it's at a very modest scale. All of these things that are taking place at the community level are part of the bedrock of society. And no society really progresses in a healthy manner unless the bedrock is firm, the foundation is firm. And so this development of individual capacities, this emphasis on service, especially at the local level, this emphasis on community building in all of its aspects, this may seem like a small thing when you're in your own little town or your own little village, but when it's simultaneously happening in thousands of towns and thousands of villages, it's actually an enormous process, and it's actually got tremendous potential.
Taking inspiration from the concept of the Mashriqul Askar, they invite to their devotional meetings followers of all faiths and none. Youth, distinguished for their commitment to a society founded on peace and justice, are engaging their like-minded peers in the work of building communities on this foundation.
For us to be able to achieve a heightened level of social welfare, we need to become familiar with the concept of devotion. Because if society is going to thrive, if I actually then decide to contribute to the betterment of society, I need to invest in some degree of devotion. Well, the question is, where do I learn to be devoted? Where do I learn the skills of how to devote myself? So in the Baha'i community, there are these activities where individuals are invited to a gathering of devotion. And because the Baha'i faith values diversity, this could be any individual. It could be a Christian, a Muslim, an atheist, a mystic, whoever. Each one of us will actually have the capacity to be able to learn and contribute to our society through the fulfillment of this potential that we have, which is devotion. So in these gatherings, individuals get together and they share their way of fulfilling the concept of devotion, perhaps by saying some prayers, perhaps by reading a poem, perhaps by telling a story of an instance of their contribution to society. And then by coming together and trying to connect at the level of the heart and with the intention of devoting themselves to the higher objective, this practice will help us to then give it reality when we go out and try to serve others with a sense of devotion, with a pure heart, and purely for the act of serving others.
In the institution of the local spiritual assembly exists the spiritual authority and the administrative capacity to govern in certitude, to resolve conflicts, and to build unity. The electoral process through which assemblies are formed is itself an expression of peace, in contrast to the vitriol and even violence that often accompanies elections in the wider society. Implicit in all these dimensions of an open, expanding community is the foundational recognition that all of humanity are the children of one Creator.
Baha'is are not engaged in partisan politics. In fact, we're prohibited from being engaged in partisan politics, which some people find odd. But you know what's really interesting? That the reason for not engaging in partisan politics is because they're divisive. And the whole purpose of the Baha'i faith is unity. This divisiveness, we now see the wisdom of Baha'u'llah's command when we look at today's world, when we see how political parties around the world have moved to what is now called in many articles that have been written lately, tribalism. They're no longer interested in what's good for the people of the country. They're just interested in their own fanatical ideologies and in winning and in having power. And the fascinating thing is that we're starting to see an emergence of a strain of thought that says maybe it's time to eliminate political parties. As a Baha'i and as somebody who works in global governance, I find that fascinating because it's almost like the world is catching up to something Baha'u'llah spoke of in the middle of the 19th century, that partisan politics will only lead to strife and increased conflict.
The Friends are also developing their capacity for engaging those around them, regardless of creed, culture, class, or ethnicity, in conversations about how to bring about spiritual and material well-being through systematic application of the divine teachings. One gratifying result of this growing capacity is the community's increased ability to make meaningful contributions to various important discourses prevalent in society. In certain countries, leaders and thinkers striving to address the challenges confronting their societies increasingly show appreciation for the perspectives offered by Baha'is. These contributions articulate insights derived from Baha'u'llah's revelation, draw on the experience being generated by the believers around the world, and aim to elevate the discussion above the acrimony and contention that so often prevent discourses of society from progressing. Further, the ideas and lines of reasoning advanced by Baha'is are reinforced by their practice of consultation.
Knowledge is so important to the Baha'i. I mean, Baha'u'llah has, quote after quotations, all kinds of writings, as does Abdul Baha. All the heads of Baha'i religion have talked about knowledge and its importance. If we don't keep up to date with what's going on in the world, we will not be up to date with our own principles, with our own teachings. And this is why I think there's such an emphasis on discourses with society, such an emphasis on that. In every message now, there's this reference to we have to carry on a discourse. What does that mean? It's basically to be able to talk about our principles, but know something about what's happening in the world and what, again, people who have knowledge are saying about those things. Now, I know some will say, but some people are saying things that are ridiculous. Granted, that's fine. But that's where we as Baha'is have to search for like-minded people who are in tune with the spirit of the age, who tell us how to solve poverty, how to come up with a better, just economic system, how to bring about equality between women and men, how to solve the climate problem, how to solve all of these issues, how to solve the decline of the family. I mean, these are the fundamental issues that just staying within one's religious beliefs, it's fine, that's knowledge, that's important knowledge, extremely important. But without the application of the sciences to figure out how to remedy these problems, religion becomes static. And the Baha'i faith is anything but static. It is dynamic. This is why it's called organic. It's a living thing. And so to live and to grow and to spread in a nice way, it needs both worlds. And for Baha'is, it's extremely important not to ever retreat, if you will, to some form of religion, because that's not the Baha'i faith. That's then another religion.
Sensitized as they are to the importance of harmony and the fruitlessness of conflict, The followers of Baha'u'llah seek to cultivate those conditions that are most conducive to the emergence of unity in any setting. We are heartened to see the believers expanding their efforts to participate in the discourses of society, especially those friends who, in their professional capacity, are able to contribute to discourses directly related to peace.
So in order for us to fulfill that objective of bringing people together and uniting them, we really require a new consciousness, a consciousness that goes beyond individualism, a consciousness that we are all in essence one and the same. In other words, when we're talking about humanity, human race is only one race, although it appears in many different diverse forms. We all have hands, we all have legs, we all have hearts, and so on, but that each one of us may come in different color, in different predisposition, and so on and so forth. But the issue is this, that if we actually emphasize the differences and think that those differences are most important, then we go back to divisions and strifes and going against each other and going back to the idea that I'm better than you are. But if we focus on that unity, that essential unity, that all humans are one in essence, and that is our perspective and that's our objective, then we can begin to reconstruct a society in which human values will take the utmost importance. Now, this is really not an idealistic imagination. It is something that the Baha'i community has been striving to achieve from its inception in the middle of the 19th century. In other words, one can say that the Baha'i community has managed to bring the most diverse set of individuals from around the world and rally them around this one fundamental notion of oneness. In other words, developing the consciousness of the oneness of humankind. With that consciousness, then I feel that a person in Africa is my brother or my sister. A person in Latin America is a member of my family. And with that notion, rather than competing with each other, then we get connected with each other. Now, it is important to emphasize that the claim is not that the Baha'i faith has reached perfection. It is a process in which the Baha'i faith has put itself through. It's a journey that we are all working together to get there. And through this process, I'm sure there are challenges, but the fact is that if we start with that fundamental understanding of reality, that we are all one in essence, that is the unifying force that will bring us closer to each other rather than dividing us.
There are many well-meaning people in the world who recognize the concept of the oneness of humankind, which is ultimately an approach to our fellow human beings that we believe is necessary for the establishment of world peace. And it also includes an attitude towards global institutions. That is, that global institutions have to be either created or the existing ones have to be reformed to give them more authority to help to organize and operate a peaceful world. And so to do that requires a change of attitude, a change of orientation. And that oftentimes requires a deep transformation in the individual. And deep transformation is what religion is all about. It's that power that can cause people who might otherwise not even talk to each other to become close associates and even loving friends. And that's where religion comes in, and the Word of God is the common tool that's available to every human being in helping to bring about that personal transformation.
For Baha'is, the attainment of peace is not simply an aspiration to which they are sympathetic or a goal complementary to their other aims. It has always been a central concern. In a second tablet Abdu'l-Baha addressed to the Central Organization for a Durable Peace in The Hague, he asserted that our desire for peace is not derived merely from the intellect. It is a matter of religious belief and one of the eternal foundations of the faith of God. He observed that for peace to be realized in the world, it was not adequate that people should be informed about the horrors of war. Today, the benefits of universal peace are recognized amongst the people, and likewise the harmful effects of war are clear and manifest to all. But in this matter, knowledge alone is far from sufficient. A power of implementation is needed to establish it throughout the world. It is our firm belief, he continued, that the power of implementation in this great endeavor is the penetrating influence of the Word of God and the confirmations of the Holy Spirit. Certainly then, none who are conscious of the condition of the world can refrain from giving their utmost to this endeavor and seeking those confirmations for which we too earnestly supplicate at the sacred threshold on your behalf. Beloved friends, the devoted efforts that you and your like-minded collaborators are making to build communities founded on spiritual principles, to apply those principles for the betterment of your societies, and to offer the insights arising. These are the surest ways you can hasten the fulfillment of the promise of world peace.